The dining table looked perfect that evening. Crystal glasses sparkled, plates were neatly arranged, and the air carried the warm scent of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. Laughter echoed as relatives poured in, hugging, greeting, and settling into their seats. On the surface, it looked like a picture of unity, a family bound by love, tradition, and shared history. But beneath that warmth, something darker lingered. For years, it had been buried under silence. Nobody dared to touch it. Nobody wanted to confront it. Generations of prejudice had woven themselves into the fabric of this family, disguised as harmless jokes, quiet dismissals, or unspoken rules about who was welcome at the table and who wasn't. That night, however, would be different. The host of the dinner, a man who had carried the weight of his family, his prejudice for decades, had decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He had watched again and again as people he loved were excluded, mocked, or judged simply because of the color of their skin or the origin of their name. He had seen his own children grow up confused, torn between love for their family and shame at the values quietly passed down at every gathering. This dinner was supposed to be ordinary, a birthday celebration, a night of toasts, laughter, and good food. But for him, it was an opportunity, a chance to tear the mask away. As the family raised their glasses to celebrate, he cleared his throat. The sound cut through the chatter, and suddenly all eyes were on him. What he said next would change everything, because hidden inside that dining room was a truth so raw, so deeply buried, that once spoken, it could never be taken back. It would shatter illusions, break bonds, and force every single person there to confront the ugliness they had ignored for far too long. By the end of the night, some would leave in anger, others in tears, and a few would never see him the same way again. But he knew one thing: silence had cost too much already. Tonight, he was done pretending. Tonight, the truth would be louder than the laughter. And this family dinner, what was meant to be a celebration, would instead become the night their deepest secrets about racism were finally exposed. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to TrueHeart Tales, where we share powerful stories that reveal the hidden truths of life, stories that challenge, inspire, and open our eyes to the things too often left unsaid. Now let's return to that dining room. The man hosting the dinner was named David. In his late 40s, with streaks of gray running through his hair, he looked like a man who had carried far more than his share of invisible weight. His smile was warm, his voice steady, but behind his eyes lay years of conflict, years of watching, absorbing, and staying silent in the face of prejudice that ran through his family like an old, poisonous root. David had grown up in that very household, at that very table. As a child, he remembered the way subtle remarks were brushed off as harmless jokes. He remembered how, at family weddings or holidays, there was always an unspoken line about who fit in and who didn't. If someone of a different race or culture came into the circle, they were treated with polite smiles, but behind closed doors, whispers and judgments followed them out. At first, as a boy, he didn't question it. Like many children, he absorbed what the adults around him said, believing it was normal. But as he grew older, as he stepped out into the world and formed friendships beyond the walls of his family home, he realized how wrong it all was. The jokes weren't harmless. The whispers weren't small. They were daggers, shaping not only how his relatives saw others, but how they saw themselves. Still, David stayed silent. Every year, the same family dinners repeated themselves. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. He smiled, ate, and listened, while something inside him twisted tighter. It wasn't only about strangers anymore. The prejudice had begun to creep into the lives of people he loved. His younger cousin, who had married a woman from a different background, was barely acknowledged at gatherings. His own children, biracial through his wife's heritage, were looked at differently, never outright excluded, but treated as though they were somehow less. David couldn't ignore it anymore. Tonight's dinner was meant to celebrate his father's birthday. The patriarch of the family, a man both admired and feared, sat at the head of the table with pride. For decades, he had been the center of gravity in that household, the voice everyone followed, the example everyone silently mirrored. His words shaped the attitudes of his children, and his silence reinforced the things left unchallenged. As David prepared the house for the dinner, arranging chairs, setting the long wooden table, and placing dishes of food, he couldn't shake the storm inside him. He thought about his children upstairs, getting dressed for the celebration. He thought about the woman he loved, his wife, who had endured side glances and veiled comments for years. And he thought about the countless times he had swallowed his anger, laughed along, or simply looked away. Not this time. The house filled with voices as relatives arrived, his siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts. They embraced, exchanged gifts, and admired the decorations. On the surface, everything seemed picture perfect. But David noticed the small details others ignored, the way some people avoided standing too close to his wife, the way jokes were made in hushed tones when they thought nobody was listening, the way his children sat a little apart, sensing the undercurrent even if they couldn't fully understand it. As the evening unfolded, the laughter grew louder, the clinking of glasses filled the air, and the birthday candles were lit. The patriarch basked in the attention, raising his glass to make a toast. To everyone else, this was just another family gathering, a tradition of warmth and togetherness. But for David, it was a battlefield disguised as a celebration. Every word he heard that night was like fuel to the fire he had been holding in for years. He knew what he had to do. He knew that once he spoke, there would be no turning back. His family would see him differently. Some might hate him for it. Others might finally understand. But the silence that had lasted for generations, was finally going to break. As the last dish was cleared from the table and the final round of laughter echoed, David felt his pulse quicken. He could hear the pounding in his chest as he rose from his chair. All eyes turned to him. He was about to take a knife to the fabric of his family's legacy, tearing apart the illusion they had all clung to for far too long. What he was about to reveal would not only expose decades of hidden racism, it would force every person in that room to face who they really were. And nothing after that night would ever be the same again. The room was warm with chatter, but David felt a chill crawl down his spine. Around him, plates were full, glasses were raised, and conversations swirled with the usual mix of laughter and gossip. But beneath that surface harmony, the undercurrent was unmistakable. Sharp, unspoken divisions running quietly through the family like cracks in an old wall. It started small, almost invisible, when his cousin's wife, a woman with a gentle smile and a heritage from across the ocean, reached for a dish. David noticed how the older relatives passed it toward her with polite stiffness, their smiles just a little too thin. When his own children laughed at a joke, a pause followed, just a breath too long, as if their voices didn't quite belong in the chorus. Nobody said anything cruel outright, but the weight of judgment lingered in the air, disguised as silence. David's wife sat tall, composed, her expression calm but her eyes guarded. He knew that look well. He had seen it too many times. It was the look of someone pretending not to notice, pretending not to feel the sting of being treated as an outsider in a room where she should have been embraced as family. Every so often, her hand brushed against his under the table, a small anchor reminding him she was still there, still strong, even when the atmosphere pressed heavy on her shoulders. David's father, the patriarch, sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his court. His laughter boomed, his words carried authority, and his presence demanded attention. For decades, he had been the standard, the one everyone deferred to. But his silence in moments like these had been as loud as words. By never challenging the prejudice, by never setting a different example, he had given it permission to thrive. David's eyes moved across the table. He saw his younger brother chuckling at a half-whispered comment, one of those jokes that pretended to be harmless but carried an ugly truth beneath. He saw his aunt lean toward another relative, shaking her head slightly as if to say, "Why are they here?" And he saw his children trying to blend in, sensing more than they understood, their young faces clouded with confusion at why they were treated just a little differently. The tension tightened inside him like a rope. For years he had buried it, telling himself it wasn't the time, telling himself maybe things would change on their own. But now, sitting there, watching his wife endure the quiet slights and his children sit apart as if they were shadows, he knew the lie had gone on long enough. The moment of eruption crept closer with every passing second. Dinner plates were cleared, and dessert was brought out, slices of cake set neatly on small china plates. The family sang loudly, raising their voices to celebrate the patriarch's birthday. Candles flickered, wishes were made, and applause filled the room. On the surface, it was the perfect portrait of unity. But for David, it was unbearable. Every laugh, every toast, every hollow word felt like a mask. He looked at his father, proud and satisfied, as if the family he had built was whole, unbroken, untouched by ugliness. He looked at his relatives, smiling as though they weren't carrying generations of prejudice in their words and silences. He looked at his children, who deserved better than to inherit shame and exclusion disguised as tradition. He couldn't let them grow up in this. As the plates were set down and the conversations began to swell again, David felt his hands tighten around the edge of the table. His pulse pounded in his ears. The truth was rising inside him, unstoppable now. He thought about every time he had swallowed his voice, every time he had chosen peace over justice, every time he had let silence win. Tonight, that silence was about to break. But he knew the cost. Once he spoke, there would be no undoing it. The smiles would fade, the laughter would turn to anger, his father's pride would turn to rage, his relatives' politeness would dissolve into hostility, the family would fracture, and some wounds would never heal. And yet, he also knew the cost of not speaking. His children would carry the weight of that silence. His wife would continue to bear the quiet wounds of being unwelcome, and the cycle, the poisonous legacy of prejudice, would keep spinning into another generation. No, he couldn't let that happen. As he sat in the middle of the celebration, with the glow of candles still fading and the sound of clinking glasses filling the room, David drew in a deep breath. His heart raced, his throat tightened, but his resolve was unshakable. The storm inside him was ready to break free. And when it did, the room that had once been filled with laughter and celebration would never feel the same again. Because tonight, David was no longer just a son, a husband, or a father. He was the voice that silence had tried to bury for too long, and his family was about to hear it. The laughter had almost lulled the room into a rhythm, a steady beat of chatter, clinking glasses, and shallow smiles. But for David, it was deafening. His heartbeat pounded harder than the noise around him, echoing in his ears like a drum of war. He pushed his chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the conversation. Heads turned. A few chuckles lingered, but gradually the table fell quiet as everyone's attention shifted toward him. David stood there, hands pressed flat against the polished wood of the table. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, but his eyes, sharp, unflinching, scanned every face in that room. Family, blood, people who claimed to love him, yet had poisoned every gathering with something far uglier than they would ever admit. He cleared his throat once. The silence deepened. For a moment he almost faltered, almost told himself to sit down, to keep the peace one more time, to let the illusion of unity remain unbroken. But then his gaze landed on his children, two young faces, innocent but already marked by the tension in the room. He saw the way they sat a little apart, the way they shrank into themselves when the conversations brushed too close to who they were. He saw his wife's quiet strength, the way she endured the invisible weight with dignity that no one at this table had earned the right to demand from her. No, he couldn't sit down. Not this time. His voice cut through the room, steady at first but trembling with the force of everything he had carried for years. He spoke not of one moment, but of a lifetime. He pulled the mask from their traditions, exposing what hid beneath. He reminded them of the whispered jokes they passed around, the way they disguised cruelty as humor. He described the side glances, the dismissive tones, the subtle exclusions that had become as routine as passing the bread. He laid bare the way they had diminished his wife's presence, treating her as though she was tolerated but never embraced. He pointed out the way his children were made to feel different, even here, at the table that was supposed to be theirs as much as anyone else's. The words hit the room like stones thrown into still water, shattering the calm, sending ripples everywhere. Some faces hardened in anger. Others dropped their gaze in shame. His father's jaw clenched, the old man's pride flashing like a shield. He didn't raise his voice, not yet. He didn't interrupt, but the fury in his eyes was unmistakable. David pressed on, his voice growing stronger, sharper. He told them that silence was not innocence. That every time they laughed at those harmless jokes, every time they ignored the slights, every time they chose comfort over truth, they were complicit in something that wounded deeper than they could ever understand. He spoke of his children, how they deserved to grow up without shame, without questioning their worth, without carrying the scars of their own family's prejudice. He told them he would not allow that cycle to continue, not another generation, not under his watch. The room shifted. Some whispered, some shook their heads, but no one could escape the truth he was laying bare. Then his father rose. The patriarch, tall even in his old age, slammed his hand on the table, rattling the glasses. His voice boomed, demanding silence, demanding obedience, demanding that David sit down and stop poisoning his birthday celebration with what he called nonsense. But David didn't back down. For the first time in his life, he looked his father in the eyes and didn't flinch. He told him that the real poison wasn't his words. It was the silence the family had kept for decades. It was the prejudice his father had let fester, passed down like an inheritance no one asked for. It was the cost of pretending everything was fine when deep down, they all knew it wasn't. The air crackled with tension. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, torn between the authority of the father and the raw truth of David's words. Others muttered angrily, accusing him of disrespect, of betrayal, of airing family matters that should have stayed buried. But David didn't stop. The storm inside him had broken free, and there was no holding it back now. He reminded them that real family does not divide, does not diminish, does not wound its own. Real family does not draw invisible lines around love. Real family does not pass down prejudice and call it tradition. By the time his words fell into silence, the room was no longer a celebration. It was a battlefield. The cake sat untouched. The candles burned down to stubs. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had just been unleashed. Some relatives pushed back from the table, unwilling to hear more. A few left the room entirely, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Others sat frozen, their expressions a mix of shame, shock, and denial. His father stood rigid, his face unreadable now, as though he was staring into a mirror that reflected every truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. And David? He stood tall, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling. But inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. For the first time, the silence had been broken. For the first time, the truth had been louder than the laughter. And though he knew this family might never be the same again, he also knew this moment, This eruption was the only chance for something real to begin. The silence after David's words was deafening. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the quiet crackle of candles burning low. Plates of untouched cake sat before them, symbols of a celebration that had transformed into something no one expected. Then, slowly, the room fractured. One aunt rose abruptly, shaking her head. She muttered that David had ruined the evening, that family was about joy, not lectures. She gathered her things with trembling hands and stormed out, her husband following silently behind her. Others avoided his eyes, staring down at their plates as though the patterns on the china could distract them from the truths still echoing in the air. But not everyone left. A cousin, younger, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief, remained rooted in his chair. He seemed shaken, but not angry. It was as if David's words had cracked something open inside him, a recognition, a memory, an echo of moments when he too had noticed the quiet slights, but never dared to name them. He didn't speak, but the look on his face was enough. He had heard, and something inside him was changing. David's wife sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap, her posture dignified. For years she had endured the whispers, the glances, the invisible walls. Tonight, for the first time, she didn't have to carry that weight alone. Someone had finally said aloud what she had been forced to swallow in silence. When her eyes met David's across the table, they didn't need words. He knew she understood. His children watched too, their young faces filled with confusion but also pride. They had seen their father stand tall, unshaken, refusing to let anyone diminish who they were, and though they might not fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened, they would remember it. They would remember that their father had chosen truth over comfort, courage over silence. Then there was his father. The patriarch had not moved since David's final words. His shoulders were rigid, his expression unreadable, his authority no longer absolute. For decades he had ruled this table, through his voice, through his silence, through the weight of his presence. But now the foundation of that authority had cracked. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost unsteady. He didn't defend himself. He didn't apologize either. He simply said, "Enough," before sinking back into his chair, staring at the floor as though the weight of the past was finally pressing down on him. David knew better than to expect transformation in a single night. He knew his father's pride, his unyielding sense of control, would never let him openly admit the truth. But something in his posture, in the way his eyes avoided everyone else's, suggested that he had heard more than he wanted to. And sometimes, hearing was the first step, even if it came too late. The gathering ended in fragments. Some left quickly, muttering about disrespect and betrayal. Others lingered, caught in their own thoughts, unsure what to say or do. The warmth that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness that clung to the walls. David stood in the aftermath, watching his family scatter. Part of him ached at what had been broken. The bonds of blood had always been fragile, but tonight they had been tested like never before. He knew that some relationships would never recover, that some bridges had burned beyond repair. But he also knew this: silence would no longer chain him. He had given his children a gift no celebration could match, the gift of truth. He had shown them that love does not mean accepting poison in the name of peace, that family is not defined by blood if that blood carries cruelty, that dignity is worth the cost of standing alone. As he and his wife gathered their children to leave, he felt lighter. The storm inside him had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be anger, rejection, maybe even estrangement, but it would be real. No more masks, no more pretending. That night, as he closed the door behind him, David knew he had changed the story his family would pass down. The cycle of silence had been broken. The next generation would not inherit the same poisonous legacy. And perhaps, one day, when his children looked back, they would remember this night not as the evening the family fractured, but as the evening their father chose courage over comfort, truth over silence, justice over tradition. Because the real betrayal was never in speaking the truth. It was in staying quiet long enough for the poison to spread. And so the question remains. How many of us sit in silence at tables where prejudice is served alongside the food, laughing along, pretending not to see? And more importantly, when the moment comes, will we have the courage to stand up and break the silence?